It began as an ordinary night flight, a Boeing 777, gliding through the cold, thin air 35,000 feet above the North Atlantic. The passengers were asleep, some resting their heads against frosted windows, others lost in the quiet hum of the engines. Inside the cockpit, everything was routine. Digital displays glowing in calm rhythm, autopilot engaged, and radar screens showing a clear path ahead. But nature had other plans. Far beyond the horizon, a massive weather system was forming, a wall of thunderclouds stretching nearly 200 miles wide. What began as light turbulence soon grew into something darker, stronger, and far more unpredictable. On radar, it appeared as an endless red mass, the kind of storm pilots try their best to avoid. But tonight, the path of the storm had shifted, and Flight 231 was flying straight toward it. At first, the crew thought it was a passing cell. The aircraft's sensors began to flicker as static built up on the fuselage. Lightning danced across the wings like flashes from a distant war. Passengers stirred as the plane began to shake, mild at first, then violently. Oxygen masks swayed overhead, the cabin lights dimming under the strain of electrical interference. The captain, a man with more than 2 decades of flying experience, studied the instruments carefully. The storm had engulfed the aircraft faster than expected. Winds from multiple directions slammed into the fuselage, forcing the plane off course. The turbulence grew so severe that the autopilot disengaged with a warning tone that pierced the night. The controls now rested solely in human hands. Outside, lightning split the sky open, revealing a vast ocean below, black and endless. Rain hammered against the windshield so fiercely that visibility dropped to near zero. The cockpit rattled under pressure. Warning lights began flashing red and amber, and the crew braced for impact with each sudden jolt. Then came the first sign of real danger. The left engine's vibration warning. The massive Rolls-Royce engine began to fluctuate, the thrust needle jumping wildly. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the aircraft rolled slightly to one side. Seconds later, a deafening bang echoed through the fuselage. The left engine had flamed out. Fire and sparks trailed behind the wing, then disappeared into darkness. The aircraft was now flying on one engine, in the middle of one of the most violent storms of the decade. The pilot fought the controls, muscles straining as he tried to stabilize the plane. He knew what this meant. If the second engine failed, there would be no power, no hydraulics, and no way to keep the aircraft in the air. He radioed for assistance, but the storm interfered with communications. His words dissolved into static. They were flying blind, with no radar, no contact, and one functioning engine struggling against nature's fury. In the passenger cabin, panic had fully erupted. The oxygen masks had dropped. The lights flickered under lightning flashes. Parents held their children close. Strangers prayed aloud. The flight attendants, though terrified, moved through the aisles with flashlights, securing everyone they could. The plane's metallic frame groaned as crosswinds tore at it like invisible claws. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain made a choice, one that would later be called the decision that saved 300 lives. He would not attempt to climb above the storm. The altitude was unstable, and the temperature fluctuations could cause ice to form on the second engine. Instead, he chose something few pilots dared to try in such conditions: to descend through the heart of the storm, using its own wind currents to stabilize the aircraft. It was a calculated risk. At that altitude, lightning was thick, and wind shear could rip the plane apart. But the captain knew that staying higher would almost guarantee a stall. The aircraft's weight, fuel balance, and one engine thrust meant they had only minutes before they'd start losing altitude uncontrollably. The descent began. The Boeing tilted downward into the storm's core. Sheets of rain turned to solid walls of water. Each drop struck the fuselage like a bullet. The altimeter spun downward, 30,000 feet, 25,000, 20,000, as the crew manually adjusted trim to keep control. The right engine strained under the load, the exhaust temperature pushing limits. Then, as if the storm itself reacted to their defiance, a massive updraft hit. The aircraft shot upward hundreds of feet in seconds, alarms screaming in the cockpit. The wings flexed dangerously, creaking under stress. The flight instruments danced erratically, showing false readings. For a brief moment, the pilots were flying blind, guided only by instinct, muscle memory, and a fading sense of horizon. Inside the cabin, time seemed to slow. Every flash of lightning revealed the same terrified faces. The mother holding her baby, the old man gripping his seat, the flight attendant bracing herself near the galley. Yet somehow, amid the chaos, the aircraft held together. By now, they had fallen to just over 15,000 feet, low enough to regain partial communication. The storm's grip began to loosen, though the winds still battered the fuselage. The crew made a rough bearing toward a possible emergency landing route, but the radar was fried, and they didn't know exactly where they were. Only that land was somewhere east. The captain checked the remaining fuel. It was dropping faster than expected. Lightning had damaged one of the fuel pumps. They might not make it to the nearest airport. Still, he kept the aircraft level, trying to buy every possible minute. As the storm clouds churned below, one thing became clear. This flight, which began as a routine journey, had now turned into a battle between man and nature. A test of endurance, skill and willpower. Outside the cockpit windows, the lightning began to fade, replaced by thick gray clouds glowing faintly from the moonlight above. The worst had passed, but their ordeal was far from over. Because just as the turbulence eased, a new warning appeared on the display. Fuel imbalance, hydraulic pressure drop. The right engine, their only remaining lifeline, had begun to fail. The flight that had already defied one disaster was now heading into another. The storm no longer sounded like thunder. It sounded like war. Each strike of lightning was a weapon, every gust of wind a force of destruction. The Boeing 777 glided helplessly through a sky that seemed determined to tear it apart. The pilots had lost all engine power. The aircraft was now little more than a metal silhouette drifting through chaos. Rain streaked across the cockpit windows, driven sideways by hurricane winds. Inside, the air was heavy with heat, tension, and the metallic scent of stress. The only sounds were the rushing of wind and the muted hum of emergency systems, barely clinging to life. The flight deck was a dim world of red and amber, the last few, instruments glowing faintly, like candles in the dark. Every flicker of light reflected on the pilot's eyes that refused to surrender even as the altitude ticked away like sand in an hourglass. Altitude, 4,800 feet. They were running out of sky. The storm thickened around them like flying inside ink. Visibility was almost zero. Outside, the wings flexed violently, catching glimmers of lightning that cut across the blackness. The nose of the aircraft trembled as wind shear pounded it from every direction. In the passenger cabin, fear had settled into silence. No one spoke, no one screamed anymore. The masks dangled from the ceiling like silent reminders of what was at stake. Every passenger could feel the slow, steady fall, the weightless sensation that meant they were gliding, not flying. Back in the cockpit, the radar flickered again. A miracle flash of green and black static revealing the terrain ahead for just a moment. It wasn't good news. A valley stretched below, but on both sides, high mountains loomed, jagged, invisible, waiting in the dark. The pilot knew they had one path and one chance. Miss it by even a few degrees, and the aircraft would vanish into the storm forever. He adjusted the control yoke gently, aligning the nose toward the valley's faint outline. The hydraulic pressure remained barely within range. He couldn't afford any sharp movements. The wings were taking a beating. Another jolt, another vibration, another warning flashing silently in the background. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cockpit for half a heartbeat, long enough to see the altitude reading fall below 4,000 feet. Rain poured across the glass like rivers. The plane trembled as turbulence surged up from below, shaking it like a leaf in the wind. They had been airborne for nearly 20 minutes since losing both engines. 20 minutes of silence, calculation, and controlled descent, and now, the world beneath them was beginning to take shape. Through a thin break in the clouds, the captain caught sight of something. A faint reflection, water. A lake, perhaps, at the valley's edge. But beyond that, a stretch of dark land, flat and long. It wasn't an airport. It wasn't even a runway. But it was enough. Altitude, 3,200 feet. The control surfaces creaked as he began a shallow turn. Each movement was a gamble. Too steep and the wings could stall. Too soft, and they might overshoot the only patch of hope in the valley. The turbulence grew worse. Wind roared against the aircraft. Lightning firing across the sky like flashing artillery. Static crackled through the cockpit radios. Useless. but constant, as if the storm itself were trying to speak. The co-pilot's instruments flickered one last time before dying completely. The entire cockpit went darker still. Only the backup altimeter and attitude indicator glowed faintly, the final guardians of control. Altitude, 2,800 feet. The nose pitched downward slightly. The descent rate increased, faster than it should have. He pulled gently back on the yoke, fighting the pressure, trying to find the delicate balance between lift and gravity. The storm fought back, tossing the aircraft like driftwood in the sea. The valley loomed closer, a narrow corridor, surrounded by invisible mountains, cloaked in rain. To the right, a flash of lightning revealed the ridgeline, terrifyingly close. To the left, another bolt illuminated the dark slope of Earth. Between them lay a single winding path of flat land. That could mean survival or destruction. Altitude, 2,000 feet. The passengers felt the descent quicken. A few clasped hands. Others stared at the cabin ceiling, eyes wet, silent prayers on their lips. The seatbelt signs still glowed, a small, flickering reminder of order in the midst of chaos. Inside the cockpit, a low whine began to echo through the airframe, the sound of wind screaming through the engines that no longer burned. The Boeing 777 was still graceful, still loyal to the hands that guided it, even as gravity pulled harder. The pilot adjusted trim again, leveling slightly. The flaps responded slowly, almost reluctantly. Hydraulics were fading fast, but even partial lift was better than none. Altitude, 1,400 feet. Outside, the storm began to thin. Rain light shifted from black to gray as the valley opened below. The faintest trace of dawn glimmered on the horizon, soft gold peeking through the clouds like hope itself. Through the windshield, the ground came into view, a rough, uneven patch of earth. Puddles glimmered under the weak light. It wasn't a runway, but it stretched far enough, flat enough and clear of obstacles. This was it. The final chance. The only chance. Every instinct, every hour of training, every memory of flight had led to this moment. The pilot steadied his breath, eyes fixed on the horizon line, hands unwavering despite the chaos around him. Altitude 900 feet. The storm raged behind them like a living thing. Wind tore at the wings. The rain returned, but weaker now, as though the tempest itself knew it was losing. The valley walls blurred past. The aircraft was too fast, too heavy, too low, but it was lined up perfectly. The radar altimeter called out its silent countdown in red digits. 600 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. The earth rose to meet them. The flaps extended halfway. The nose lifted slightly, the perfect glide. For the first time in nearly half an hour, the Boeing 777 was flying straight and level, wings steady, storm fading behind. And just ahead, the ground waited, a narrow strip of salvation. The storm had done everything to destroy them, but the pilot's decision had brought them through it. The next seconds would decide whether 300 lives would end or become legend. The first flash of lightning struck with the force of a camera flash in a dark, room-blinding, searing, and impossibly close. For a split second, the entire cockpit was bathed in electric white. The pilot's hands tightened around the yoke as the Boeing 777 jolted violently, tossed sideways by a blast of wind that felt more like an explosion. Outside, the storm had swallowed the plane whole. Clouds churned like boiling smoke, black and silver, torn apart by streaks of lightning that zigzagged through the sky. Rain hit the fuselage with the rhythm of gunfire. Inside, the calm voice of routine had vanished. The cabin lights flickered. Warning alarms began their unending chorus. In the cockpit, the crew's instruments flashed with urgent signals. Autopilot disengaged. Power surges detected, electrical instability spreading across the systems. The captain fought to stabilize the jet, pushing the throttles gently forward. But the right engine's RPM gauge began to fall slowly at first. Then suddenly all at once, a deep metallic groan rolled through the aircraft. Then came silence, the kind that cuts through every heartbeat. Right engine failure. The 300-ton aircraft shuddered as asymmetric thrust pulled it sideways. In an instant, the balance was gone. The co-pilot worked quickly, feathering the rudder to compensate, but the turbulence was merciless. Lightning illuminated the cabin again, revealing passengers clutching armrests, faces lit by fear and disbelief. The entire aircraft trembled as it began to lose altitude. At 27,000 feet, they were still above the worst of the storm, but not for long. The pilot knew what was coming. The storm cell below was a monster, its radar signature stretching across hundreds of miles. Descending meant flying directly into its heart. But staying at altitude with one engine failing meant losing control altogether. A decision had to be made, and it had to be made now. The captain's eyes scanned the instruments. Fuel pressure on the left engine still stable. Hydraulic systems within range, but cabin pressure warnings starting to blink. In the distance, lightning outlined. The shape of a mountain ridge, the last thing anyone wanted to see in a storm this violent. He leveled the wings, reduced thrust, and began a controlled descent. The plane dipped into the clouds like a diver plunging into dark water. Thunder roared around them, echoing through the airframe. The Boeing 777's navigation lights glowed faintly red and green, the only sign of life in the chaos outside. The descent was brutal. Rain lashed the windshield so hard it looked like molten glass. Every flash of lightning revealed the edges of the world, a terrifying canvas of storm and vapor. The pilots could feel the vibration through the deck, the stress of a machine fighting for its life. At 18,000 feet, the instruments flickered again. The left engine, the last lifeline, coughed once. A shudder ran through the cockpit. Then another alarm began to scream. Engine 2 power loss detected. This time there was no explosion. No flash, just a slow, steady decay of power. The thrust lever vibrated under the captain's hand as the engine spooled down. Within seconds, the noise that had always defined flight, the deep, reassuring hum of turbine power, faded into an eerie silence. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks had already dropped. Panic spread like electricity through the aisles. But above the fear, there was a strange calm from the flight deck. Every movement there was slow, deliberate method over madness. Despite the chaos, the pilot's focus had narrowed to one simple truth: keep the aircraft flying. Below, the radar painted a nightmare mountains, lakes, and only one patch of possible safety, a flat valley somewhere ahead, half obscured by rain. But with zero visibility and failing navigation, finding it was like looking for a shadow in the park. They were dropping fast 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. The storm outside had become a wall of black. Every second felt like a countdown. If they couldn't restart at least one engine soon, the ground would arrive before they were ready. And then in that chaos, a flicker of possibility, hydraulic pressure stabilized for a brief moment. It wasn't enough to restart power, but enough to give limited control over flaps and rudder. The pilot seized the opportunity, trimming the nose slightly up to reduce descent speed. In the cabin, passengers braced as the lights flickered again. Through a window, one man glimpsed the orange glow of lightning far below, reflecting off distant water. Somewhere out there under the storm was land. The aircraft now glided silently through the clouds, rain streaking across its surface. The once mighty jet now powerless yet strangely graceful. The world had reduced to sound and sensation. The roar of wind, the creak of metal, the soft glow of dying instruments. At 5,000 feet, the radar finally cleared for a second, and there it was. A stretch of land, barely visible between the mountain ridges. Long, narrow, uneven, but it was something. A field, a road, maybe both. In that moment, it didn't matter. It was hope. And in that instant, the captain made his final decision. The one that would change the outcome of everything. No airports, no communication, no engines. Only instinct, courage, and faith that the storm would let them through. The Boeing 757 was now a glider, a 250-ton metal bird suspended in a storm. The descent rate increased rapidly. Winds buffeted the fuselage. The nose dipped lower. At 15,000 feet, the storm's full fury unleashed itself, hailstones the size of fists. Turbulence so violent the wings flexed like breathing lungs. Lightning forked again, this time so close it left the smell of ozone. Inside the cockpit, he turned the nose slightly toward that. Faint shadow of safety, set the flaps for descent, and began to glide. Every warning light in the cockpit was red. Every second was borrowed time. But as the Boeing 777 dropped beneath the clouds, the rain thinned just enough for the pilot to see the outline of the Earth again. A long valley stretched ahead, narrow, rough, but alive with the possibility of survival. The flight and its 300 souls were heading straight toward it. The miracle, if it was coming, would have to happen now. The valley stretched ahead like a shadowed scar in the earth. narrow, uneven and half hidden beneath the last trails of storm. The Boeing 777, stripped of all power, cut through the thinning clouds in complete silence. Only the sound of rushing air filled the cockpit, the sound of gravity reclaiming what once belonged to the sky. Below, the terrain rolled unevenly, a patchwork of fields soaked in rain. There was no runway, no lights, no sign of civilization. Just Earth, wild, wet, and uncertain. And yet for the captain it was enough. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Altitude 800 feet. The descent had to be perfect. Too fast, they'd break apart. Too slow, they'd stall and fall from the sky. Rain spattered across the windshield like glass shrapnel. The control column shook violently in his hands. He steadied it inch by inch, holding the nose just above the horizon. Behind him, the passengers sat in absolute stillness, unaware that the aircraft beneath them was gliding purely on instinct. No power, no control beyond human hands. Lightning flickered one final time in the distance. Faint, retreating, like the storm itself had given up the chase. The wind softened, the turbulence faded, and for the first time in nearly half an hour, the Boeing 777 flew in calm air. Altitude 500 feet. The valley floor rushed closer. The pilot adjusted the flaps. What little hydraulic pressure remained responded sluggishly. He extended them halfway, just enough to slow the descent. The nose lifted gently. Outside, dawn had begun to bloom. Soft rays of sunlight cut through the mist, painting the storm clouds gold and silver. Below, the earth shone wet, a mirror of the sky above. Altitude 300 feet. The captain leveled the wings. There was no runway, just a long, open stretch of farmland flooded by the storm. It would have to do. The aircraft glided in silence, wings outstretched like the calm before impact. Each second stretched into eternity. The shadow of the aircraft rippled across the soaked ground, closing in. Then, the faintest contact. The landing gear kissed the earth. A soft, almost ghostly thump. Then another. The tires struck mud and water instead of asphalt. The aircraft jolted, bouncing violently as the ground tore at its wheels. A wave of spray exploded from beneath the wings. The nose pitched forward. The captain pulled back just enough to keep it level. For a moment, it seemed impossible. 250 tons of metal gliding across open land. The wings flexed, the fuselage shuddered, but it held. The aircraft slowed violently, unevenly, plowing through puddles, mud, and shattered grass. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks swung wildly. Luggage tumbled from overhead bins. But the screams were drowned by the roar of survival itself. The sound of friction, resistance, and finally, stillness, and then silence. The Boeing 777 came to a halt, tilted slightly, engines dark, landing gear buried halfway in soft earth. The rain had stopped. Steam rose from the wings as the warm metal met the cold morning air. A hush fell across the valley. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hiss of cooling metal and the slow, rhythmic ticking of systems shutting down. Then a faint orange glow crept across the clouds, dawn breaking in full. From above, the scene was hauntingly beautiful. A great aircraft surrounded by mist and mountains, resting like a fallen bird that refused to die. Minutes later, rescue beacons began to ping faintly. Through the static, emergency locators, transmitting their first signals after the blackout. The world would soon learn what had happened here. The passengers, 300 lives, suspended between sky and earth, had survived the impossible. Their descent through lightning, through silence, through sheer chaos, had ended not in tragedy, but in the soft embrace of dawn. And in the cockpit, the pilot sat quietly, hands still on the controls. His uniform soaked, his face streaked with sweat and rain. Before him, the sun rose over the valley, gentle, golden, calm. The storm that had tried to end everything was gone. He looked ahead through the cracked windshield. Fields, mist, and mountains, the same world that, minutes ago, had seemed to disappear forever. Now it was alive again. Outside, the cabin doors opened. Cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and soil. Passengers stepped out one by one, feet sinking into mud, eyes filled with disbelief. They had landed, without power, without visibility, without hope, and yet they were here. The valley that could have been their grave had become a place of rebirth. News of the incident would later circle the globe. Miracle landing in the storm. Experts would debate how it was possible. How a powerless Boeing 777 managed to glide over 30 miles through one of the worst thunderstorms ever recorded, landing safely with no loss of life. But those who lived it would remember something else. Not the data, not the analysis, but the feeling. The stillness before the landing, the calm in the chaos, and the moment the earth rose up not to destroy them, but to catch them. For 300 souls, it was not just survival. It was a miracle written in thunder and dawn. And for the man in the cockpit, it was the decision that would define him forever.